O my God, O my God, this thy servant hath advanced towards thee, is passionately wandering in the desert of thy love, walking in the path of thy service, anticipating thy favors, hoping for thy bounty, relying upon thy kingdom, and intoxicated by the wine of thy gift. O my God, increase the fervor of his affection for thee, the constancy of his praise of thee, and the ardor of his love for thee. Verily thou art the most generous, the Lord of grace abounding. There is no other God but thee, the forgiving, the merciful. Abdu'l-Bahá.
So maybe in the next Zoom we can summarize something that we have picked up and learned from reading her diary. So I don't want to speak about it now because that would slow the reading of the book. So we're back, 358, Greenacre, Maine, and she wrote this in 1947. If only I had written of Greenacre day by day while we were there with him. There are unforgettable things, but so many details, precious details, have slipped away. Mama and I were in Bass Rocks when the master's invitation reached us. Bass Rocks, on a cliff above the ocean, was Mama's paradise, and we could never afford more than 2 weeks of it. So when Ahmad's postcard came with word from the master that he wished us to spend 3 days with him in Greenacre, all she could think of at first was that the 3 days would be lost from her paradise. I won't go, she said. Oh, Mama, an invitation from a king is a command, and this is from the King of Kings. Well, I'll go for just 1 night and no more, and I won't take a suitcase, just a little Irish bundle, so that we can't stay more than 1 night. So she packed our little Irish bundle, 2 nightgowns, 2 toothbrushes or combs and brushes, and a change of underwear. When we arrived at the Greenacre Inn, the master met us at the door with loving marhaba. Then he drew me into the dining room. She does not want, he asked in English. I couldn't tell the truth then, but of course he knew. Pictures come back to me, Mama and I following him down a path to the Iranion, where he was to speak to the believers. He was all in white in the dark, Mama whispering to me, it is like following a spirit. A tussle day after day to keep Mama in Greenacre, in which dear Carrie Kinney helped me. A night when a horrifying young man came to a meeting at the Kinney's house from head to foot. He was covered with soot. His blue eyes stared out from a dark gray face. This was Fred Mortensen. He had spent half his boyhood and young manhood in a prison in Minneapolis. Our beloved Albert Hall, who was interested in prison work, had found him and taken him out on parole and given him the Baha'i message. But Albert Hall was dead when the master came to America. Fred Mortensen, hearing that Abdu'l-Bahá was in Greenacre and having no money to make the trip, had ridden the bumpers on freight trains to his presence. He came into the meeting and sat down and was very unhappy when the master, pacing back and forth as he talked, took no notice of him. It must be that he knows I stole a ride, thought Fred, who told me all about it afterward. But no sooner was the meeting over and the master upstairs in his room than he sent for Fred. Fred had said nothing to anyone about his trip on the bumpers, but the minute he entered that upstairs room, the master asked, smiling and with twinkling eyes, how did you enjoy your ride? Then he took him from Fred's hand his soot-covered cap and kissed it. Years later, during the First World War, when the American believers sent $10,000 for the relief of the starving Arabs, the messenger they chose to carry the money to the warring countries was Fred Mortensen. The master declined the $10,000, relieving the Arabs himself by his own hard labor. He went to his estate near Tiberias and himself plowed the fields there, then stored all the grain in the shrine of the Baba. For this, he was knighted by Great Britain when British rule replaced Turkish in Palestine. It was meant as an honor, but to me, it was like an insult. It nearly killed me after that to direct my supplications to Sir Abdu'l-Bahá Abbas. But to return to Greenacre, one day the master, speaking from the porch of somebody's cottage while the believers sat on the grass below, made this fascinating statement. We are in affinity now because in pre-existence we were in affinity. Let's ask him what he meant by that, whispered Carrie to me. So in the evening, while the master was in our room, Mama's and mine, and Carrie sitting there with us, I put the question to him. I will answer you later, he said. But he never did outwardly. In a minute or so, Mama, with that funny boldness of hers, which could sometimes burst through her timidity, said, Master, I would like to see you without your turban. He smiled. It is not our custom, Mrs. Thompson, to take off our turbans before ladies. But for your sake, I will do it. And oh, the beauty we saw then. There was something in the silver hair flowing back from his high forehead, something in the shape of the head, which in spirit, in spite of his age, made me think of Christ. There was another night when Carrie, Mama, and I, and a few other believers were sitting in the second floor hall. Suddenly, on the white wall of the floor above, at the head of the staircase, the master's great shadow loomed. Mama slipped over to the foot of the stairs and looking up with adoring eyes called, Master? And still another night. This was our third in Greenacre. Again, we were sitting in the second floor hall, but now the master was in our midst. We must say goodbye tomorrow, Mama said to him. Oh no, Mrs. Thompson, he laughed. You're not going tomorrow. One more day. And he laughed again. You see, I'm leaving for Boston day after tomorrow, and you are of my own family. Therefore, you must travel with me. And Mama submitted now with the satisfaction wonderful to see. She was proud as a peacock. He said, I was one of his own family. She kept repeating to me. Once he called Mama and me into his room, and among other things he said was this, there are correspondences, Mrs. Thompson, between heaven and earth. And Juliet's correspondence in heaven is Mary of Magdala. There's a parenthesis here on page 361. This diary, owing to the fact that it was written under difficulties, has large areas left out of it. I find that I have not spoken of what seemed then such a crucial thing, Lua's departure for California. But since she was not at our house when the master visited us on July 12th, and my last account of being with her is dated the morning of July 11th, I'm sure she must have left the night of the 11th. I have just one story to tell of Lua with the master in California. I want to tell it for two reasons. First, because of its value and also its humor. Then because another version of it is still being told by the believers, less direct and much less like the master. This is how I had it from Lua herself. She and George Ralston, who had gone with Lua to California, were driving one day with the master when he closed his eyes and apparently fell asleep. Lua and Georgie talked on, I imagine, about their own concerns, for suddenly his eyes sprang open and he laughed. I, me, my, mine. Words of the devil, he said. November 12th, 1912. Now she's back. Her diary. The master is here again. I met him at the boat last Monday, November 11th. I met him alone, and this is how that happened. At noon, on November 11th, Mirza Ali Akbar arrived from Washington to find living quarters for the master and the Persians. I had had a wire from him earlier asking me to meet him at the station and to house hunt with him, which I did. The master was to come at 10 that night, and we thought we had plenty of time to notify their friends so that they could meet the ferry boat. But later, another wire came to our house, relayed to me through Mama and Mr. Mills at Mrs. Champney's, and luckily catching me there, saying that the master would arrive at 8. Through a series of accidents, Mr. Mills' chauffeur landed us first somewhere in New Jersey, and then at the Liberty Street station, and there was no time to telephone anybody. This would be very bad, Mirza, said Mirza Ali Akbar, but we couldn't help it. Turn the lights on. We had accomplished everything else. Had rented again the deer house on 78th Street, Mrs. Champney's, and found extra room for some of the Persians. Now, Mirza Ali Akbar insisted on my taking Mr. Mill's car and going at breakneck speed to the 23rd Street station to try to meet the master there if he should come that way, while he himself waited at Liberty Street. I reached 23rd Street just in time. The ferry boat was approaching and very close to the dock, standing at the end of the pier. I saw it with a chain of lights. I saw Dr. Farid. Then the master rose from his seat on the deck and entered the brightly lit cabin. Soon he came toward me down the gangplank. Ah, Juliet, he said, taking my hand in his hand and drawing me along with him so that I walked beside him. But he didn't invite me to drive to his house with him. Instead, he sent me back after Mirza Ali Akbar, Dr. Baghdadi, and Mirza Mahmoud going with me. We returned all together to 78th Street. Oh, to see him in that house again, sitting in his old corner in the English basement, the corner and the bay window. I had been very naughty with Mama that day and had grieved her. My precious mother was brought up in luxury, lived in luxury until Papa died. She cannot get over her sensitiveness about our too apparent poverty, and she simply won't have people to meals. I had begged her to make an exception of Mirza Ali Akbar, who was arriving at such an awkward hour, and to let me bring him back for lunch, but she wouldn't hear of it. Whereupon I flew into a temper, told her what I thought of her false pride, and stamped out of the house. Now, entering the master's house with the 3 Persians instead of welcome, I received a blow. The master didn't even look at me. How is your mother? Were his first words. Is she happy? Then he told me to go straight back to her, but to return the next day. I went back and comforted her with his rebuke to me. Welcome all the friends that I haven't seen before. There's so many. Wonderful, welcome. Early as I could on November 12th, I sought his beloved presence. Ruth and Lawrence White, who have lately been married, were with him, and Rhoda and Marjorie. It seems impossible sometimes for the physical ear or the human mind to retain his divine words. They moved me to tears. Don't cry, said the master with his infinite tenderness. The 12th of November, the birthday of Baha'u'llah, was the day of Mrs. Krug's meeting, and never shall I forget it. There at Mrs. Krug's, the master invoked Baha'u'llah, and as his cry, Ya Baha'u'llah, rang out, I hid my eyes, for it was as though he were calling someone on the same plane with him, someone whom he saw and who would certainly come. He came, the Blessed Beauty, the Lord of the host. A power flashed into our midst, a great sacred power. I can find no words. Burning tears poured down my cheeks, my heart shook. After the meeting, the master, who was resting in another room, sent for me. I had supplicated through Waliullah Khan that he would come to the meeting at our house Friday. Tomorrow, Juliet, he said, I will tell you about your meeting. Now go back to the house and wait till I come. I did so, and he soon came and sat in the corner of the window in the English basement, just as he used to last summer. Carrie Kinney was there and Mr. Hoare. He had spoken so often in public and in private of an inevitable world war, warning America not to enter it, that I felt moved to mention it now. Will the present war in the Balkans, I asked, terminate in the world war? No, but within 2 years, a spark will rise from the Balkans and set the whole world on fire. Soon, he rose and calling, Come Juliet, and beckoning to Waliullah Khan, took us out to walk in his garden, that narrow strip of park above the river. As we followed him, Waliullah Khan said, how blessed to be walking in his footsteps. He led us to a bench and sat down between us, clasping my hand tightly. And then he began to ask me questions, question after question about the believers in New York, as to a certain condition among them, a lack of firmness in the covenant, which I had never suspected, which I was really ignorant. Of course, I did know that earlier there had been awful confusion. Some teaching that Abdu'l-Bahá was like Peter, others that he was Jesus himself, but I thought that time was past. But I don't know, my Lord, I said, I knew I would tell you. I know you don't know, he laughed. And I do know. There are many things I know that you do not know. I was only testing you. I have loved you for your truthfulness, for the truth you spoke in a matter you remember. I wanted to see if your heart were in the same state of truthfulness. Then he said, with those who are against the center of the covenant, you must not associate at all. When you find that the soul has turned away from the covenant, you must cut yourself off completely from him. You will know these people, you will see it in their faces. How on earth, I thought, would I trust my judgment on the faces? He answered my unspoken thought at once. You will see a dimness on their faces, like the letting down of a veil. My Lord, I said, I feel like that I have failed in everything. I have failed you in all my pitiful efforts to bring about unity, and I know my failure has been due to lack of strict obedience. Obedience to the Master is firmness in the covenant. You must associate with the steadfast ones. He mentioned 3 people who, since his return, since I met his ferry boat alone, have weakened, have wreaked their displeasure on me, one of whom had even scandalized my name for several years. Then added to the list Mason Remy. This was bitter. You must be a rock as they are rocks. My Lord, I asked with a sinking heart, am I not firm in the covenant? You could be more firm, he laughed. Oh, my Lord. He rose and we began to walk. I had hoped, I said miserably, that nobody loved me better than I. I know you love me, Juliet, he answers, but there are degrees of love. Then he told me he carried a measuring rod in his hand by which he measured the love of the people, and that rod was obedience. At the corner of the entrance to the park, he paused. You must love me, he said, for the sake of God. You are all I shall ever know of God. I am the servant of God. You must love me for his sake and not for the sake of Baha'u'llah. I'm very kind to you, Juliet. He added, I know, my Lord. Now go back to your mother so that she may be pleased with you. He left and left me to wait for the bus. But when he had crossed the street, when I saw him stop for a moment to speak to Abdu'l-Bahá Khan, I sank on the chain of the fence, utterly broken-hearted. Oh, I'm nothing, I thought. I have done nothing but fail him, which was just what he wanted me to see, I suppose. But could it be that I was not firm? I examined my character. Yes, it was unstable. On Wednesday, November 14, I went very early to my Lord's house. He was on the point of going out, but he called me to him. My Lord, I said, as he paced up and down his room, I want to thank you for your great mercy last night. I was asleep and you woke me. I pray you may ever be awake. There are a few souls in America, he continued, whom I have chosen to be teachers in this cause. You're of those, Juliet. I wish you to have all the qualities of a teacher, that is all. Then he asked me to wait till his return. I waited all day. At 5 o'clock, he came and called me to his room on the upper floor. With that exquisite courtesy of his, the sweetness of which almost breaks the heart, he, I can hardly write it, asked me to excuse him for keeping me waiting. To wait for you, my Lord, is joy of these blessed days when we can wait for you. He went on to tell me why he had been detained, etc. The record of this last month must be sketchy. I cannot copy it all as it concerns other people and conditions that are past and best forgotten. November 28, 1912. It is Thanksgiving Day, and I'm thankful and happy. Everything that means my personal happiness, even every hope is lost. My Lord has entirely stripped my life, but I pray that he has freed my spirit. On November 15, the master came to our house, 48 West 10th Street, and gave a most wonderful talk in the front room on the first floor to a great crowd of people who filled both the front and back rooms and the hall. See Promulgation Universal Peace, pages 431 to 437. Driving down, I brought George up from the basement and stood him on a chair so that he could see the master. He thought the master was God and was frightened. Driving down to us with Mrs. Champney, our Lord has said, the times has come for me to throw bombs, and he threw them in his talk that night. I have spoken, he said, in the various Christian churches and in the synagogues, and in no assembly has there been a dissenting voice. All have listened and all have conceded. that the teachings of Baha'u'llah are superlative in character, acknowledging that they constitute the very essence of spirit of this age, and that there is no better pathway to the attainment of its ideals. Not a single voice has been raised in objection. At most, there have been some who have refused to acknowledge the mission of Baha'u'llah, although even these have admitted that he was a great teacher, a most powerful soul, a very great man. Some who could find no other pretext have said, these teachings are not new, they are old and familiar. Was one of his most powerful. The master certainly proved it. The address was taken down and will be printed. On November 18th, oh yeah, I don't know if you've heard this. At the Kinney's house, the master put Howard MacNutt through a severe ordeal, an inevitable ordeal. Mr. MacNutt had been one of these few who, when I first came to New York, had thought that the master was like Peter, just a glorified disciple. But for years, he had never mentioned this point of view, and I thought he had gotten over it. In Chicago, there are some so-called Baha'is who are still connected with Khair Allah, the great covenant breaker, and last week the master sent Mr. MacNutt to Chicago to see them and try to persuade them to give up Khair Allah. Otherwise, he was to cut them off from the faithful believers. He, Mr. MacNutt, wrote Zia Baghdadi that he had found these people angels and did nothing about the situation. He had just returned to New York and was to meet the master at the Kinney's house that evening, November 18, for the first time since his unfruitful trip. I was in the second floor hall with the master and Carrie Kinney when he arrived. The master took him to his own room. After some time, they came out together into the hall. An immense crowd gathered by then. Have you written?
Attends, une seconde. 1 minute, friends.
What's happening here? Okay, it was a production issue, has to do with my voice. That is not loud enough. So I will speak louder. So I go back to the paragraph. He had just returned to New York and was to meet the master at the Kinney's house that evening, November 18, for the first time since his unfruitful trip. I was in the second floor hall with the master and Carrie Kinney when he arrived. The master took him to his own room. After some time, they came out together into the hall. An immense crowd had gathered by then on the first floor, which is open to the whole length of the house. I heard the master say to Mr. MacNutt, "Go down and tell the people, I was like Saul, now I am Paul, for I see. But I don't see," said poor Howard. "Go down and say I was like Saul." I pulled his coattail. "For God's sake," I said, "go down." "Let me alone," he replied in his misery. "Go down," commanded the master. Mr. MacNutt turned and went down, and his back looked shrunken. The master leaned over the stair rail, his head thrown far back, his eyes closed, in anguished prayer. I sat with Carrie on the top step watching him. This is like Christ in Gethsemane, I thought. We could hear the voice of Howard MacNutt stumbling through his confession. I was like Saul, but he seemed to be saying it by rote, dragging through it, still unconvinced. Nevertheless, when he came upstairs, again the master deluged him with love. By that time, the master was back in his room, and as Mr. MacNutt appeared at the door, he ran forward to meet him. Our Lord was all in white that night, and as he ran with his arms wide open, he looked like a great flying bird. He enfolded Howard in a close embrace, kissed his face and neck, welcomed with ecstasy this broken man who, even though bewildered, had obeyed him. The next night, while Mama, Miss X, and I were together in the master's presence, Miss X brought up his chastisement. The master sighed. I immersed Mr. McNutt in the fountain of Job last night, he said. The next morning, Sunday, November 24, I hastened to the master's house. I knew it could be full of people, friends from other towns who had come to attend the banquet and to be with the master during his last days here. I knew Mason Remy was in New York and that I should have to meet him, perhaps this morning, and to face him before the master and all the believers would be misery. Our engagement in the eyes of the believers had been the most ideal romance. I had seen many moved to tears by it, and when the engagement was broken, every one of them had resented it, taking up cudgels for Mason and putting the entire blame on me. As for Mason, he had said, I am an Indian, I never forgive. For over a year, Mason and I avoided each other in perfectly absurd ways. When I had to go down to Washington, I had written him, please stay away from the meetings while I'm there. Then one day in Washington, when I boarded a moving, rocking streetcar, I fell backward on somebody's lap and turned to find myself sitting on Mason's knees. I haven't seen him since, and now, as I approached the master's house, knowing he would surely be inside, if not at that moment, very soon, I wanted to turn and run. Suddenly, I saw that all this was nonsense and should be overcome at once before the master's departure. An idea occurred to me. I stood on the doorstep a minute or two, bracing myself to carry it out, to walk boldly up to Mason and say, let's go to the master now and tell him we are friends again and want to work together in the old way as a real brother and sister in the cause. All at once, though still a little shy, I felt eager to do this, to put things right. I opened the door, and there stood Mary Hopper, evidently waiting to waylay me. She looked very mysterious, important, and excited. Juliet, she said, I must have a word with you. There is something I have to do. Then she exhorted me to marry Mason. She told me she knew the master wished it. She had private information. The master had said I would suffer until I did marry him. If I have to suffer, I said, I prefer a respectable martyrdom. I'd be nothing but a common prostitute if I married him. And I can't believe, Mary, that the master really said this. May Maxwell came up at that moment, very earnest and starry-eyed, to reinforce Mary. Very well, I said, I will talk with the master myself about it. He's just upstairs, thank God, no further away than the top floor of this house, and whatever he wants me to do, I will do. I went up with Waliullah Khan, but first I stopped on the third floor and had a little private cry with Waliullah. Percy Grant was to come the next day to the master. This would be his last visit. And who could tell what would happen then? What miracle might not happen? What change might not take place in him? And now, Mason Remy looming again. We found the master on the point of going out, standing in his room, holding a big, white, folded umbrella. I knelt and he pressed my head against his arm and took my hand in a tight clasp. Speak, he said. Tell the master, Badiullah Khan, that I know he will laugh at this because I want to speak about Mary Mason. I have heard Mary Hopper that the master wishes it. If he really does wish it, I'm ready. No, said the master. His eyes were twinkling and the corners of his mouth quivering as though he were trying not to smile. It was this way, he said. I never interfere. Mrs. Hopper came and told me that she wanted to unite you and Mr. Remy. I said, very well, try. But it is just as I wrote you long ago, unless there's perfect agreement, perfect harmony, love, these things are not good. I kissed his tender hand. Needless to say, after this, I couldn't go near Mason Remy. On November 20th, the master spent the morning in my little room. Now, what is that little room? It's the extension room on the second floor of 48 West 10th Street, now divided into two rooms. Now we're gonna have to draw a plan here of the house of Juliet Thompson one day, but we're not gonna do it today. They're gonna tell you this, some people are leaving in about maybe 30 minutes, so I'm not gonna finish Juliet Thompson tonight because I don't wanna rush this. I prefer to just do a little bit, you know, I'm enjoying the time with the master and Juliet Thompson. I don't really care. I know I have pressure from my producer to finish it, but you know, I mean, this has been dragging for 10 Zooms. But hey, I could be doing this for 500 Zooms. I don't care. I mean, we're talking about the master. I mean, if you can find...
Well, ask your participants if they want to do an 11th Zoom on Juliet Thompson. It's a democracy.
No. The democracy is, they don't like it, they're not gonna come. That's democracy. They're not gonna come. Next week, I'm gonna find myself alone. I'm gonna be speaking alone in this Zoom with nobody except my daughter. Yeah. And I'm gonna just be with Abdu'l-Bahá and Juliet Thompson, and they're gonna be with...
You're assuming I'll open the Zoom room.
There'll be good pressure on you to... I just came back from a trip and I got you some gifts, Juliet, that you have to give me the Zoom next week. You can't do this. You can't do this to me, you know? We're not going to mention what I brought you. Anyway, so...
Oh my God.
I know Madame Mahavash has to go. I know... What's her name? I know... Sudabe has to go. So, you know, we'll do it. When you're about to go, just say we're leaving, and then I will just stop. And I mean, what we read was really exciting. I think. I mean, I don't know. That's what I think. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this.
Yes.
If I thought this was boring, I wouldn't be sitting here.
It's fascinating. It's
reading
really,
this.
really fascinating.
And if you find another book that talks about Abdu'l-Bahá the way she talks, I mean, we are assuming everything she's saying is correct. If it wasn't correct, I don't think this should be authorized book of the whole world. So this has happened. Okay, she's telling you the truth and probably didn't say everything because she threw away a lot of stuff. So on November 20th, the master spent the morning in my little room. I just explained that little room. Once more, his glory shone in my room. His life was diffused in it. It is a sanctuary now to me, like a chapel in our house. He had brought Mrs. Champney with him and Mr. McNutt, and during the morning, Mr. McNutt, who was standing behind the master very humbly, lifted the hem of his abba to his lips. Mama brought the master some soup, which she had prepared especially for him. I was just wishing for soup, he said sweetly. You, Mrs. Thompson, have the reality of love. Mama then showed him Papa's picture and he kissed it. After a while, he left us and was absent for some time. When he came back, he said, I have been in every room of your house. Now, just a parenthesis. Just personal stuff. My brother sent me a recording of my mom's telling her how they left for Egypt to Morocco to be to became Knights of Baha'u'llah in northern Morocco, and she was explaining to the interviewer that Abdu'l-Bahá had gone up to the house of my father. He went up 5 flights of stairs to visit them. So I mean, Abdu'l-Bahá has been everywhere, visiting people. It's incredible. So, so he kissed the picture of Juliet Thompson's father. So, as I said, I have been in every room of your house, in your house. And when he bade us goodbye, as he swung down the stairs with his powerful step, his voice rang out, "This house is blessed." After he had gone, I sat in the chair he had sat in and wrote an appeal to Percy Grant. I tried to reach you by phone this morning to tell you the master is soon returning to Haifa and that he wishes to take his portrait with him. Percy had been exhibiting it. Percy had been exhibiting it in the chapel of his parish house. So I'm going to take his portrait with him. And to ask you if sometime tomorrow I could come for it. I want to thank you too for your hospitality to the master's picture and for your beautiful reference to it last Sunday, of which I have heard. You have given too many an opportunity to see at least a portrayal, if a very weak one, of a dear face, which I doubt if most of us will see again. He is going back into dangerous conditions. Dear Percy, will you let me go without saying goodbye to him? Only the other day he was speaking of you. To this, I received a very stiff answer, merely asking the date of the master's sailing and his address. On Saturday, the 23rd, the master spent most of the day in Montclair. When I went to his 78th Street house in the late afternoon, I was met with joyous news. By staying over in Montclair, he had missed reserving his passage on the Mauretania, and his sailing was now delayed. Also, I heard that Percy had telephoned and asked for permission to call on Monday. That night, the master gave a banquet at the Great Northern Hotel. May Maxwell, Mary Hopper, Marjorie, Rhoda, Mama, and I sat at the same table. Just before the food was served, the master rose from his seat, a vial of attar of rose in his hand, and passed among all the tables, anointing every one of his guests. As his wonderful hand, dripping perfume, touched my forehead, as he scattered on my hair the fragrant drops, my whole being seemed to wake and sparkle. At the end of his talk, again, in Promulgation of Universal Peace, page 447-48, he said, such a banquet and such an assemblage command the sincere devotion of all present and invite the downpouring of the blessings of God. Therefore, be assured and confident that the confirmations of God are descending upon you, the assistance of God will be given unto you, the breath of the Holy Spirit will quicken you with a new life, the sun of reality will shine gloriously upon you, and the fragrant breeze of the rose gardens of divine mystery, divine mercy will waft through the windows of your souls. Be confident and steadfast. God, I love this image of the windows of your souls. The following morning, November 25, I spent with the master. One heavenly thing he said was this: I have searched throughout the length and breadth of this land for flames. I want the flames. The solid ones are no good. Then he told me I was a flame. And this is, if you have the book, you don't need this, but if you don't have the book, this is the banquet. Anyway, just a banquet, big banquet. And he spoke beautifully of Mama. If I had a mother like yours, Juliet, I will never deviate, even by a hair's breadth, from her wishes. That night, Mama went to see him with me. He was looking utterly spent, but he insisted on keeping us, wouldn't let us go for at least an hour. In the meantime, at 5 o'clock, Percy Grant had come. The master was out, but expected back any minute. He had to address the women's club early in the afternoon, and from there was to go to Mrs. Koshran's. Through Waliullah Khan, he had asked me to wait and detain Percy. While I was waiting in the English basement, Carrie and Mrs. Champney with me, a taxi cab stopped at the door. Then in came Dr. Grant, very big and rigid, his black clerical broadcloth and his white clerical collar firmly molded around him. Soon the master returned. I can still see that figure entering the room like a mighty Eastern king in his long green abba edged with white fur, his white turban. I can see his outstretched arms, his divinely sweet smile, can hear the music of his voice, that long, oh, welcome, oh, Dr. Grant, as though to meet Dr. Grant were the most delectable thing on earth. Then he took Percy's hand and held it, never letting it go, while I saw them together and began to talk smilingly to him. You must excuse me for keeping you waiting, Dr. Grant. I am very, very sorry to have kept you waiting, very sorry. But I was captured by 300 women this afternoon. It is not a dreadful thing to be captured by so many women, and at this I felt wickedly amused. The women in America dominate the man, the master continued. Come upstairs with me. And still holding Percy by the hand with the lightness of a spirit, he led him up the first flight. I shall never cease to see those two figures, the king of the East and the West, in the garments of an Eastern king, leading the way to an upper chamber. The resistant clergyman, hardened into his clerical clothes, stiffly following, pulled up the stairs by a too strong hand. But when Percy came down, after a very long time, his whole face was changed. His eyes were like burning stars. His mouth softened, relaxed. He grasped my hand and pressed it. May I take you home, Juliet? Thanks, Percy. I'm staying here for a while. Soon after he left, Dr. Farid rushed down the stairs to me. There is hope, great hope, he said. He was a changed man today, entirely different from last summer. He seemed deeply touched at the thought of the master returning into danger, and I asked if he would cable him if any trouble should arise so that he might do whatever he could. He asked also if from time to time the master would send him news through one of your humblest followers, he said. When he spoke of danger, the master replied that he had never feared danger and told him the story of the Turkish investigating committee sent to Akka by Abdul-Hamid, how the verdict of this committee was that he, Abdu'l-Bahá, must die, that he must either be crucified at the gate of Akka, sent alone to the desert of Fezzan, where he would inevitably starve, how at that time the Italian consul, a friend, had arranged for a ship to be sent to Haifa, ostensibly with cargo, but really to help the master escape, and how the master has said, my father Baha'u'llah never delivered himself, though he had the opportunity. From this prison, he spread his teachings. I, therefore, will follow in his footsteps. I will not deliver myself. Then Dr. Farid went on. The master told Dr. Grant of the hastening of the Committee of Turkey to lay its verdict with all possible speed before the Sultan. But before they landed on Turkish soil, the cannon of God had boomed forth at the gates of the Sultan's palace. Abdul-Hamid was deposed by the rising of the Young Turks, and Abdu'l-Bahá was set free. So ended the master, God delivered me. The miracle had happened. Percy Grant was a changed man. All right, guys, this is it. So next week, we will finish and we'll start another story so that you will have both Juliet Thompson and someone else that you know already, and I won't tell you the name. Maybe if I can actually open up books and do some reading, because I just came back from Europe and I have to deal with all kinds of headaches. But again, it was wonderful seeing you all. Madame Pauline is there, and Alex and Abbasi, all these wonderful people. You're all Juliet Thompsons. You're sisters of Juliet Thompson. Even Alex is a sister of Juliet Thompson.
Very much so.
Brother of
Thank you.
Juliet Thompson, or brother of Juliet Thompson. Yeah, but it's all wonderful people. That's it. See, the whole point of this is that we all learn from as much from her about obedience. And remember, this is a century ago. I mean, this is over a century. We talk about 100 years ago. Now we have the House of Justice. We have counselors. We used to have hands of the cause, counselors, and institutions all over the place. There was nothing. It's just Abdu'l-Bahá. That's it. Abdu'l-Bahá that she likened to Christ. And as you know, I mean, you've heard, Baha'u'llah speaking of Abdu'l-Bahá as he possessed the ether that was with Abdu'l-Bahá. These stations, we're dealing with the supreme manifestation of God. We're not dealing with just anything. We're dealing with, those that come from Christian background have to understand that we love Christ, but this is the return this is Christ, return. I mean, that's it. That's our belief is that. And you cannot hide that stuff. You cannot say, no, we believe in principles of unity. And it's not about unity. It's about truth. It's about reality. This is it. This is it. Christ returned. That's it. Is Baha'u'llah. Abdu'l-Bahá is the servant. He is the center of the covenant. And there's power in all this. And so we are all part of that. So that all should give us courage to teach, because we are dealing with 3 years of the life of this lady. This lady lived longer than that. She did stuff we don't know about yet. She just wasn't just hanging around Abdu'l-Bahá day in and day out, and he was always holding her hand. I mean, she ended up going to Mexico and doing stuff and teaching. I'm sure she was a good teacher. We don't know because I don't have access to those books. The only thing I have this little book here, 3 years. That's all I have. I haven't done research. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of stuff written somewhere. If it is, I haven't seen it. So she, in the eyes of Abdu'l-Bahá, the essence of Juliet Thompson was to prepare her to be a teacher. So that's why this Zoom is about teaching. We all teach differently. I mean, some people may not go down the streets and knock at doors, but that's not the point. Because teaching is through example. It's the things you do. That's it. Teaching is about teaching. There's probably hundreds of thousands of methods of teaching. And Baha'is have to be comfortable with whatever method fits them. Because if you put a method that they don't like, you frustrate people for nothing. Because Baha'u'llah is not imposing methods. He has not said which method to use. The method we use today with the Institute is a process whereby we can reach probably millions of people. But it is not the only way of reaching people. You teach different ways. So we have to learn obedience. And that's one of lessons we can maybe have discussions of that next week or week after that. What have we learned from her stories? I mean, it's a very personal story. I mean, if she hadn't written anything, imagine how many people have met Abdu'l-Bahá and haven't written much. I mean, there are many people have, even non-Baha'is have written about Abdu'l-Bahá. We probably can, since we are, as Abilata has said, my dear producer has said, we are dealing with that period. We are not going to deal after 1921. We're going to stay with Abdu'l-Bahá. We're going to stop there. We're going to go backwards. We're going to start from the Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Bahá. We're going to stop there. I mean, the faith has million stories, but we are focusing there. We haven't finished with all those people that were gravitating around Abdu'l-Bahá, but we just have to find source material. So I share what I find. I'm not going to do major research because I probably won't have time. I don't have even access to things. But my producer is a major researcher, so she's going to dig stuff for me. and get me stuff so that I can share with you guys, so that you can become like Juliet Thompson, so that Baha'u'llah will bless you and you will do miracles.